In a dusty corner of the Hartford Historical Society, where wooden shelves were stacked with forgotten relics, an old picture frame leaned quietly against a filing cabinet. Hundreds of artifacts lay there, but nothing stopped Dr. Sarah Mitchell like the intricately carved wooden frame. It was a 1903 wedding photograph, one that, at first glance, looked like any other Victorian wedding. The groom in a stately black tuxedo, standing next to the bride in an elaborate white gown, meticulously embroidered with lace and lace. Sarah, a historian of early century American photography, had seen thousands of similar portraits. The stiff pose, the stern gaze, the well-placed hands, everything conformed to the standards of the era. The bride's face was no exception. Calm eyes, tightly closed lips, the kind of expression often seen in photographs where the exposure time was so long that a smile was almost impossible. But as Sarah gently lifted the frame closer to the window, letting the late Connecticut sunlight filter through the glass, an indescribable feeling suddenly pulled her closer. "It's just a normal wedding photo," she whispered to herself, but her fingers still unconsciously traced the wooden frame as if guided by an invisible thread. On the back of the photo was a line of text so small it was nearly swallowed by Time Thomas and Elizabeth June, 15th, 1903. Hartford. No last name, no photographer's mark, no other information. Based on the clothing and the quality of the photo, Sarah guessed they must have been members of Hartford's rising middle class in the early 20th century. She prepared to set the photo aside to join dozens of others waiting to be filed. But at that moment, a ray of sunlight slid through the glass, hitting the photo at an oddly perfect angle. And then Sarah stopped. For a split second, something about the bride's face made her heart pound. Something that shouldn't have been there. Something that defied everything she knew about photography and social customs in 1903. Sarah returned the photograph to her desk, her hand shaking so slightly that she noticed it. Under the study lamp, she picked up her magnifying glass, her companion who had helped her uncover so many hidden details over the course of 15 years. And as the circular lens gently magnified each line, the bride's face suddenly transformed. Sarah blinked repeatedly, as if she were being tricked by the light. But no, the more she adjusted the focus, the clearer the image became. On the bride's lips was a smile. Not the forced smile of later years, but a gentle, delicate curve as if she were trying to suppress a deep joy. It can't be. Sarah breathed softly, the sound fading into the quiet archive room. In those days, photography required models to hold poses for several seconds. A genuine smile, even a fleeting one, was nearly impossible to capture without blurring the image. Moreover, Victorian weddings required absolute solemnity, a social code not easily broken. Sarah turned to the groom. His face remained the typical expression of the era, hard cold, standing straight as if carved from stone. Everything about him was standard. Only Elizabeth the bride, with the enigmatic smile, was sending a secret message to the camera. Or perhaps to someone outside the frame. Questions began to swirl in Sarah's mind. Who was the bride smiling at a lost lover? An untold secret? Or simply a moment of happiness that escaped convention? Without hesitation, Sarah opened her laptop. The soft tapping of the keys echoed through the quiet archive room. She began to search for a list of wedding photographers in Hartford in 1903, comparing the locations of the studios with the background details in the photo. The seemingly ordinary portrait turned into a maze of theories and possibilities, drawing her and us into a mystery that had lain dormant for more than a century. Do you hear the call of the past? A small anachronistic smile waiting to be deciphered. The patterns on the wallpaper, the arrangement of the furniture, even the carpet under the feet of the newlyweds. Every little detail in that photo could be a clue, a message from the past. The more Sarah observed, the more this portrait felt like a door opening to countless layers of secrets, each line hiding something untold. The next morning, when the morning dew still lingered on the old roofs of Hartford, Sarah was at the city library. She sat among stacks of old books, yellowed newspapers from 1903 traces of a time more than a century gone. She had barely slept the night before, her mind constantly drawn to the image of the mysterious bride and that anachronistic smile. Her professional curiosity had now turned into a real obsession. The wedding announcements in Hartford Courants that June made no mention of a Thomas and Elizabeth married on the 15th. Not willing to give up, Sarah expanded her search to neighboring towns. West, Hartford East, Hartford Bloomfield. But the results were still a blank. It was as if the couple had never existed on any official document. "Excuse me." Sarah approached the librarian's desk, where Mrs. Peterson, who had been with the library for more than 3 decades, was patiently sorting through files. "I'm looking for a couple from 1903. Sarah said, her voice soft, as if she were afraid to wake the sleeping books. "They're Thomas and Elizabeth, married June 15th. Do you know of any other sources to check?" Mrs. Peterson pushed her reading glasses up the bridge of her nose, thinking for a few seconds. "Have you tried looking in church records? Many weddings don't make it into the papers, especially the smaller ones. Trinity Episcopal keeps excellent records. Catholic churches have archives going back to the 1890s. On cue, Sarah spent the afternoon knocking on doors in churches all over Hartford. At Trinity Episcopal, Reverend Williams took her to the basement, where the leather-bound marriage registers were kept in an air-conditioned glass case. He ran his finger along the handwritten entries. June 13th, Thomas Martin and Elizabeth Hayes. June 20, Thomas Richardson and Elizabeth Collins. He paused, shaking his head slightly. But no one on the 15th listed just their first names without their last names. Could it be? Sarah asked that there were special circumstances that needed to be kept private. Weddings that weren't quite standard. Reverend Williams thought for a moment, then said slowly, "Sometimes a bride gets pregnant before marriage, or a couple from very different social classes. Such weddings are usually held quietly with little paperwork, few witnesses." Sarah's heart beat faster. Could Elizabeth's smile be a trace of such a secret? A joy mixed with fear revealed only by a slight curl of the lips? As she stepped out into the parking lot, the Connecticut afternoon sun dyed the trees a golden yellow. Sarah felt as if she were on the verge of a major discovery, something far beyond a photographic anomaly. Back at the Historical Society, she decided to examine every inch of the portrait and its wooden frame with the patience of a scientist. Carefully removing the photo from the frame, she hoped to find a scrap of paper, some trace hidden for over 100 years, and her persistence paid off. Between the photograph and the backing, Sarah found a small folded piece of paper, yellowed by time. Her hand trembled slightly as she unfolded it, revealing a few lines of faded brown ink. Dear Thomas, by the time you read this, I will have left Hartford. The photograph must tell the story I cannot tell. Find what others cannot see. Remember our signal. Forever yours. E. Sarah stared at the paper, her mind racing. Our signal. Was it a smile? Was Elizabeth sending a message through her expression? Something that strict Victorian society would not allow her to say aloud. With that question in mind, Sarah examined the photograph again. Under the magnifying glass, she noticed that Elizabeth's left hand, tucked gently under the folds of her dress, was not in the usual bridal position. The fingers were bent in an odd shape, as if making some kind of sign. Sarah took close-up shots of hands with her digital camera, then began researching Victorian women's sign language secret messages conveyed through fans' bouquets of flowers or even the placement of fingers. In a 1902 etiquette book, she came across the concept of finger telegraphs, a form of hand signal used to send discreet messages in social situations where speech was taboo. An illustration in the book stunned Sarah. Elizabeth's finger pose matched exactly with a symbol that read, "Warning things are not as they seem." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her breathing slowing. The significance of this discovery washed over her like a cold wave. Could that anachronistic smile and the slight twitch of her hand be a cry for help buried for more than a century? Can you hear it? From the bottom of the photo, a faint signal seemed to be knocking on the door of the present, waiting for someone to finally understand Elizabeth's message. This was more than just an unusual wedding photograph. It was the desperate mark of a woman trying to leave evidence of something terrible. Elizabeth's smile was not joy, nor was it a secret joke. It was a brave mask cleverly concealing the terror churning inside, and the hand signal hidden under her wedding dress was a cry for help, a plea, forgotten for more than 120 years. With Elizabeth's strange letter in hand and a new understanding of hidden messages in photographs, Sarah expanded her search. She went beyond marriage records and began to dig through missing persons reports and newspaper articles from the summer of 1903. As night fell, the archival light reflected off her strained eyes as she scanned the old text, hoping to find any clue about a woman named Elizabeth, who had disappeared around the time the photograph was taken. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, the Society column in the July 1903 Hartford Currents. Amid the small reports of tea parties and summer balls, Sarah came across a note that was barely noticed. The ladies of the Hartford Women's Association express concern about Mrs. Elizabeth Hayes, who has not appeared at the Noble Charity Ball, although she has confirmed her attendance. Elizabeth Hayes. The name made Sarah shudder. It was one of the names Reverend Williams had mentioned in Trinity Episcopal's marriage register. The wedding was dated June 13th, just 2 days before the 15th on the back of the photograph. Sarah rushed back to the church, her heart pounding. Reverend Williams opened the marriage register again, and this time, Sarah examined the ink carefully. She quickly noticed the anomaly. The entry for Elizabeth and Thomas was in a different handwriting than the surrounding entries, and the ink was darker, as if it had been added later. Pastor Sarah asked quietly, "Is it possible that this entry was added, maybe backdated?" He frowned, leaning closer to the page. "It's entirely possible. In 1903, marriages sometimes needed to be legalized to avoid scandal. A couple might have been married civilly or under unusual circumstances and then registered with the church to save face. That clue led Sarah to another place, the Hartford Police Department's historical archives deep in the basement of City Hall. There, a young policeman with a passion for local history, Officer Martinez, helped her sift through the steel cabinets containing records from the early 20th century. Missing Persons Report, 1903. He muttered, pulling out a thick file. Hartford was growing fast that year. Lots of people came and lots of people disappeared. Sarah's eyes immediately stopped when she saw a report dated July 20, 1903. Elizabeth Hayes, 23, reported missing by her sister Margaret. Last seen at her home on July 15th. Brown hair, green eyes, about 5'4". Her family said she had been acting strangely in the weeks before her disappearance. The report also listed Margaret's address on Asylum Street, Hartford's most upscale neighborhood at the time. When Sarah went to look for her, she was surprised to find the original Victorian house still standing now, converted into small apartments. The current owner, an elderly man named Robert, smiled kindly as Sarah told her about the investigation. The Hayes have lived here for 40 years. The previous owner said he found some old papers in the attic when he was renovating. It might still be there. In the dusty attic beneath the insulation installed decades ago, Sarah discovered a small wooden chest. Inside were letters, a few photos, and a diary bearing the name Margaret Hayes, written in careful handwriting. The notes from the summer of 1903 revealed a story that made Sarah's skin crawl. June 10th, 1903. Elizabeth has been acting strangely since she met the man named Thomas. She rarely talks about him, only that they are going to be married. I have not met him yet, which is unusual for my dear sister. June 16th, 1903. Elizabeth returned from the wedding, looking quite different. She smiled when she thought no one was looking, but there was fear in her eyes. She begged me not to ask her about Thomas or where they lived. July 1st, 1903. I followed Elizabeth today and found that she was not living with Thomas as she had said. Instead, she rented a small room above Mrs. Patterson's bakery on Main Street. When I confronted her, she burst into tears and confessed that the marriage was only a way to escape from some terrible situation. She said no more. July 14th, 1903. Elizabeth came to me tonight in a panic. She said Thomas was not who she thought he was. She had discovered something that put her in danger. She said she was leaving Hartford immediately and asked me to keep a photograph saying that if anything happened, it would explain everything. Sarah put down the diary, her heart pounding. The wedding photograph, the timeless smile, the mysterious hand, all of it strung together into a trembling message from the past. Did you sense it? Through every line, every ink blot. It was as if a voice from 1903 was whispering, pleading with someone. Anyone to finally understand the truth Elizabeth had risked her life to convey. This was never just a wedding portrait. Not really. What you're looking at is a quiet act of defiance. A single frame of film that carried a woman's last plea for help. Elizabeth's smile, so faint and careful, wasn't joy. It was a mask, a brave, fragile mask, stretched over fear. And the delicate curl of her hidden hand, it was a signal, a message no one understood for more than 120 years. Sarah learned this the night she held Elizabeth's note against the fading light of her study lamp. With the paper trembling between her fingers, she felt the weight of an unfinished story. If the photograph hid one secret, how many more lay scattered across Hartford waiting to be found? She widened her search. Marriage records were no longer enough. She sifted through yellowed newspapers from the summer of 1903, each brittle page whispering the voices of a city long gone. Police ledgers, society columns, missing person reports. Sarah read them all, hunting for the name Elizabeth. Her first true spark came from an unlikely corner, a single sentence buried in the Hartford Courant's society pages. July 1903. It was little more than a passing note of gossip. The ladies of the Hartford Women's Auxiliary expressed concern for Mrs. Elizabeth Hayes, who failed to attend the quarterly charity luncheon despite having confirmed her attendance. Elizabeth Hayes. The same name Reverend Williams had once mentioned from Trinity Episcopal's marriage register. But something didn't fit. That marriage was recorded as June 13th, 2 days before the date carefully inscribed on the back of the wedding portrait. Sarah's pulse quickened. She hurried back to Trinity Episcopal, the heavy wooden doors creaking in welcome and warning. Reverend Williams brought out the marriage register again. This time, Sarah studied the page with a detective's eye. The handwriting on Elizabeth's entry looked wrong. The ink sat darker and fresher than the lines above it, as though it had been added after the fact. Reverend Sarah asked softly, could this entry have been backdated? The old minister peered closer, his brow furrowing. It's possible, he admitted at last. In 1903, some marriages were regularized. If a couple wed under unusual circumstances, they might later register with the church to avoid social scandal. Unusual circumstances. The phrase echoed in Sarah's mind like a door unlocking. Next, she descended into the cool, dust-scented basement of Hartford's City Hall. There, Officer Martinez Young, curious and fond of local history, guided her through rows of steel filing cabinets that groaned under the weight of forgotten lives. Missing person reports from 1903, he murmured, tugging open a heavy drawer. Plenty of those. Hartford was growing fast back then. People came and went. Sarah leaned in, scanning page after page until one record leapt out. July 20th, 1903. Elizabeth Hayes, age 23, reported missing by her sister Margaret. Last seen July 15th. Brown hair, green eyes, 5'4". The note at the bottom made Sarah's breath catch. Family reports unusual behavior in the weeks prior to disappearance. The report included an address on Asylum Street, once Hartford's most fashionable neighborhood. When Sarah visited, the grand Victorian house still stood, though now divided into apartments. An elderly owner named Robert welcomed her in after hearing of her research. The Hayes family, he mused. I've lived here 40 years. The previous owner said he found some old papers in the attic during renovations. Might still be up there. Together they climbed into the dust-choked attic. Beneath layers of insulation, Sarah uncovered a small wooden trunk. Inside lay a collection of letters, photographs, and a diary. The name Margaret Hayes inked in graceful script across the cover. Sarah opened it with trembling hands. The entries from the summer of 1903 painted a slow descent into dread. June 10th. Elizabeth has been acting strangely since she met that man Thomas. She speaks little of him, only that they plan to marry. I have not been introduced, which is most unusual for my dear sister. June 16th. Elizabeth returned from her wedding ceremony changed. She smiles when she thinks no one is watching, but her eyes hold fear. She begs me not to ask questions about Thomas or their living arrangements. July 1st. I followed Elizabeth today and discovered she is not living with Thomas as she claimed. Instead, she rents a small room above Mrs. Patterson's bakery on Main Street. When I confronted her, she broke down and confessed the marriage was arranged to help her escape some terrible situation. She would not explain further. July 14th. Elizabeth came to me tonight in great distress. She said Thomas was not who he claimed to be, and that she had discovered something that put her in danger. She spoke of leaving Hartford immediately and asked me to keep a photograph she said would explain everything if something happened to her. July 21st. My sister has vanished. I have reported her missing, but the police seem disinterested. They suggest she may have left with her husband, despite my insistence that Thomas is equally missing, and that their marriage was unusual from the beginning. Sarah closed the diary, her fingers numb. Elizabeth's smile in the wedding portrait wasn't celebration, it was documentation. A final, desperate attempt to leave proof. But who was Thomas? Margaret's diary gave no surname. Sarah turned to the 1903 Hartford City Directory, cross-referencing every man named Thomas. One entry tightened her focus. Thomas Miller, private detective. Office at 245 Main Street. Just 3 blocks from the bakery where Elizabeth had secretly rented a room. Private detectives of that era were complicated. Some served justice. Others served whoever paid the highest fee. At the Hartford History Museum, Sarah studied a display of early 20th century business cards. Among them rested Thomas Miller's own calling card, discreet investigations, recovery of missing persons and valuable items. Confidential consultations available. Dr. James Walsh, the museum curator, leaned over the glass with a knowing look. Private detectives in 1903 operated in a grey area, he explained. Some were true professionals, others were hired thugs. They might retrieve runaway daughters for wealthy families, recover stolen documents, or quietly manage blackmail one way or another. A shiver slid down Sarah's spine. Could Elizabeth have been a target rather than a bride? Her next discovery darkened the story further. A brief Hartford Current article from September 1903 reported Thomas Miller's sudden death, a so-called accident in the railroad yards. The paper claimed he fell from a moving freight car while investigating missing documents. The timing was uncanny. Just 2 months after Elizabeth vanished. By now, Sarah sensed she was chasing more than a missing person case. Margaret's diary hinted that Elizabeth had uncovered a dangerous truth about Thomas. But what? Sarah returned to the historical archives, broadening her search to major Hartford events in 1903. After days of patient sifting, one headline finally flared to life. Hartford National Bank Scandal, May 1903. An astonishing $50,000, over $1.5 million in today's dollars, vanished from the bank's accounts. Private investigators were hired to trace the stolen funds. One name among them, Thomas Miller. The timeline fell into chilling order. Early May, the embezzlement discovered. Late May or early June, Elizabeth meets Thomas. June 15th, the wedding portrait. July, Elizabeth disappears. September. Thomas is dead. But how did Elizabeth fit into this dangerous equation? Sarah returned once more to Margaret's diary, combing for overlooked clues. There, in an entry from spring 1903, the final piece surfaced. Elizabeth has secured a position as a secretary at Hartford National Bank. She is quite excited about the opportunity, as it pays well and the work is respectable for a young woman. Sarah's heartbeat quickened. Elizabeth worked inside the very bank where the money vanished. She would have had access to records, transactions, and hidden discrepancies. Perhaps she found evidence pointing to the real thief, or evidence that Thomas himself was involved. The wedding suddenly made sense. Thomas hadn't been courting her at all. The ceremony was a trap, a cover-away to gain Elizabeth's trust and silence her discoveries. Elizabeth, realizing too late, used the portrait session as her last chance to leave a coded warning. The forced smile, the hand signal, the note to be found if she disappeared. Still, Sarah needed proof. In the Hartford Public Library's newspaper archives, she uncovered an August 1903 article describing a breakthrough in the investigation. The missing $50,000 had been traced to forged documents and falsified transactions. The culprit, the article whispered, was not a low-level employee, but someone with intimate knowledge of the bank's procedures and access to official documentation. Someone like a private detective, someone like Thomas Miller. And so, the portrait remains a silent witness. A bride who was never truly a bride. A woman who smiled for the camera, not in joy, but in warning. If you ever find yourself staring at an old photograph, one of those stiff sepia images where no one quite smiles, look carefully. Ask yourself, what story might they be begging you to hear before it's too late?